Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and greetings from France once again. Tonight's a special lecture that has been many years in the making, but was delayed by the pandemic on the greatness and truly phenomenal diversity and explorative impulses of Miles Davis. Quick note, coming up in probably about a week, I've mentioned we have this experiment coming, and it'll be in about a week, and you'll have the opportunity, if you're interested, to be a white rat, I guess. So if you're interested in becoming a white rat in a philosophy experiment, then stay tuned, coming up very shortly indeed. So, to Miles Davis. Now, I was prompted to do this lecture on Miles Davis because I saw a biographical film of Miles Davis at a theater with a friend of mine who's a jazz arranger, pianist, and musician. And we both came out thinking the same thing. The documentary talked about how Miles Davis used a lot of drugs and struggled with drugs for most of his life, which is true. Talked about the fact that he had a lot of wives and girlfriends and was a somewhat abusive, not very helpful boyfriend or partner much of the time, which is also quite true. But shockingly spent very little time on the phenomenal impact that Miles Davis had on jazz and music in general, and on the unique capacity that he had for musical development and exploration. And so we had planned to do a concert that featured 2- and 4-handed arrangements for piano that would explore Miles's music and highlight some of the key elements of his development. That was canceled. It had been scheduled for performance, but was canceled because of the pandemic. And so for a while, I've been having these notes hanging around. I thought, all right, this would be a good opportunity to take a moment and reflect on the greatness of Miles Davis and what makes him significant as a musical pioneer, really. And to give a moment of reflection on that, and also ponder why he's, I think, less well discussed as a composer, arranger, and developer of music forms, which I think is simply has to do with the nature of the music industry during his lifetime up till today. So if we fast forward to Miles when he begins playing music more publicly, he started playing in bands and stuff when he was quite young. But at this point, 1944, 1945, in New York, Miles is attending Juilliard. I don't believe it was called Juilliard at that point. It was the music school soon to be known as Juilliard. Anyway, a very fine music school at the time. And Miles Davis was there to study horn and music in general. Now, basically, he did not go for very long, and he dropped out after about a year. However, he cited 2 important influences of attending Juilliard that I think helped put a groundwork, a foundation underneath understanding his contributions to music for the rest of his life. One, he said it greatly improved his understanding of music theory. Now, this is important because Miles was not just randomly exploring or getting lucky or just playing what he felt, although certainly he did that as well, but he was an intellectual. He understood exactly what he was doing, understood the musical concepts he was developing. He had ideas that he wanted to see performed in the world, and he pushed very hard to get that done. He was very much a composer, although he did not write particularly. He worked with other people and did that, but his understanding of music theory was very well developed. And second, he talks about the nature of being able to visit a music library that Juilliard had. And again, it's important to note that if you go back to 1944, 1945, just as the war is ending, what's available on radio in New York City would be more than just about anywhere else in the country or the world, but it's still a small selection of the music of world history. Orchestral performances are rare and expensive. Recordings are there, and he could have heard those, but to be able to go to a library that had the music itself, which Miles could read and understand, and this is a rare, to be able to look at a score, particularly an orchestral score, and both understand and be able to hear the music, this takes both training and a particular type of mind, and Miles Davis certainly had that. And for the rest of his life, he was able to, this is why he's able to work with someone like Gil Evans so effectively. He was able to look at arrangements, understand music. He was also an accomplished pianist in the sense that he could use the piano to express and explore his ideas and to present his ideas to other people. So his capacity to give an intellectual or musically developed framework to what he wanted other people to do and how he wanted them to perform was quite profound. He was brilliant at this, and I think it's underappreciated in many of the discussions of him. But while he was at Juilliard, and what pretty much led him to drop out was he was playing in New York clubs at one of the great moments, iconic moments in jazz history. He's playing with people like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, the list goes on and on. So he's right there at the heart of bebop, right when bebop is exploding onto the scene. And it's important to note that bebop is replacing, or not replacing, or augmenting, or grows out of jazz that was primarily focused on dance music. And so you were there for dancing. And that is a certain kind of music, a certain kind of structure. Bebop, on the other hand, gave a lot of space and a lot of room for individual musical performers to express themselves, to explore solos, and to play solos off of other people's solos. So it was more music to be listened to and to appreciate individual expression and capacity than it was, certainly than it was for dance. And so some people still think this was a unfortunate offshoot of the real nature of jazz, which should have stayed focused on, the big band or dance sorts of influences. But so bebop is coming into its own. You have all the famous bebop musicians from this period in New York. And so already at 18, 19, 20, Miles Davis is in the place at the time playing with the most famous bebop musicians that would come to be known in jazz history. And they like him. He's performing with them. He gets offered a position in the Duke Ellington's big band so that he could have had a job that would have been steady and paying if that's what he had wanted. But of course he turns that down because Miles Davis does not want to play other people's music and he doesn't want to be in someone else's band. He wants people in his band. And so this is the pattern that we'll see with Miles over and over and over again. If he had just stopped and said, okay, I'm successful, I'm starting to make recordings, I know how to play bebop, the other bebop musicians like me, they're letting me play with them on their recordings, I can make a career, I can play clubs, I can tour, I can be sort of a Dizzy Gillespie figure, I can be someone like that. He could have done that, but he chose not to. So already in 49 and 50, while he's playing bebop, while he's at this seminal moment in jazz history, he gets together with Gil Evans, who he met at a party somewhere in New York. And Gil Evans is a Canadian arranger, musician, songwriter, but really orchestrator is probably the best way to think of Gil Evans. And they immediately hit it off. They became fast friends, and Miles Davis repeatedly in his sort of autobiography, that has been published, but it's sort of an interview that was edited into an autobiography, so a bit of a sort of autobiography about how influential, meaning Evans was, how much their musical ideas fed into each other, and how that Gil was really the one person that really understood often what he was trying to achieve with music. And so they get together, this loose arrangement of people, and record a series of singles effectively, with John Lewis, Jerry Mulligan, and some other musicians, a nonette, nine-piece, that in 57 are collected and released on an album called Birth of the Cool. And so to give you an idea of the music, I'll give you a series of albums that are sort of resonant with each of these periods. And Birth of the Cool is certainly one that bears a listening, because if you listen to any of the bebop albums, say from Dizzy Gillespie, around 47, 48, 49, and then you listen to The Birth of the Cool, which was recorded in 49 and 50, you'll see that Miles has gone a very different direction. Right? The sound here, there's a richer harmonic sound, less emphasis on solos. It's a whole new world. But in a pattern that will repeat, Miles Davis recorded these sessions. It's a couple of sessions over about a year. I think it was less than a year, actually, so a pretty short time frame. And then moved on. And then some of the musicians, like Jerry Mulligan, goes to the West Coast, and what becomes the West Coast sound was an outgrowth of the kind of cool jazz sound that had been explored in these recordings in 49 and 50. And this is where someone like Chet Baker comes from, meets Gary. They influence each other, and this whole sound is developed out of ideas that were not. Miles didn't like make everybody do this. He worked with these various musicians, explored this sonic landscape that was different than bebop. And then Miles moves on. The other musicians moved on, but they also often would then develop the territory that had been laid out when they had been working with Miles. And this is the pattern that repeats. Miles gets people together, has some ideas, they explore or discover a valley, call it a valley of music, and he says, all right, you guys can settle here in development. I'm off to find another valley. So instead of staying and cultivating it and growing it and making it rich and elaborate, he just moves on. He's moving on. But in this case, Birth of the Cool sound, which again doesn't come out till 57, even though it was recorded in 49 and 50. This is another thing that will recur throughout the lecture. Miles is almost always doing multiple things at once. And so giving specific dates for things is somewhat misleading. You kind of go for when albums were released. But in this case, the songs were originally recorded in 49-50, but not released till 57. By that time, the West Coast sound was well developed, and the cool jazz sound is like all comes together. But Miles had been there, 5, 6, 7 years earlier, and other people had developed it. So then Miles moves on, and he produces his first solo album, which is the Miles Davis Allstars. That again has, even though it's recorded at almost the same time as he's doing the non-network, has a very different sound, more straight head jazz, but also a little more balanced sound. And again, John Lewis is playing with him on these sorts of, at this time, in both the non-net and other aspects. And Lewis goes on, having worked with Miles Davis, and brought his own ideas. So again, it's not that Miles Davis is taking these people and making them do things or just educating them, but he's finding people who share these ideas, who resonate with his vision at a time, giving an opportunity to express and explore these ideas. And then they often go on and form other hugely influential bands or movements, entire movements in jazz. So John Lewis is famous for going on to found the Modern Jazz Quartet. And if you listen to the non-net recordings, if you listen to the work he did with Miles early, and then you listen to Modern Jazz Quartet, you can go, oh, right. And so the Modern Jazz Quartet becomes this fixture, this important band or group in jazz musical history, or musical history in general, because it blends more classical elements that Miles was bringing in. It has a more balanced sound between the pieces. It's more like a quartet, traditional quartet for, like a Beethoven string quartet, than it was like a bebop jazz band in many ways. And so you can hear that different influence is very strong if you listen to any early modern jazz quartet recording. And so already, now at this point, Miles is in his early 20s, and he could have just stopped and been a successful bebop musician. He was already recording with these people. He's soon to have his own albums out. He could have recorded in that more, straight ahead sound. He did not do this. He's already experimented with non-net and these different sounds and arrangements with Gil Evans that gave birth to the whole cool sound or the West Coast sound. But he didn't stay there either. He moved off from there and worked in these different elements that helped influence and create notions that you can see expressed in like the modern jazz quartet. So maybe he stops here. Of course not. He's never going to stop. You've probably already worked this out. So now he forms what's called his first great quartet. Now this is in the mid-50s. And again, a lot of these players overlap with each other and so on. And he has Sonny Rollins, Red Garland, John Coltrane, and Cannonball Adderley. Now that is an all-star lineup. And other people came in and sat in, like Philly Joe Jones. So there were even more, but that's sort of the main lineup. But each of these are famous. These are each famous jazz musicians, and that somehow Miles Davis is able to get all these incredibly talented musicians together to play with him and to work with them to help them express and explore and develop his ideas. And this quintet, both known for its live recordings and for its studio recordings, is one of the central parts of what came to be called hard bop, which had a different emphasis than bebop and sort of moved from that form to one that again had a little more balance. It's a little bit different rhythmically. There wasn't so much the bass and drums being in the background. They were brought in to be a more fully integrated into the band. There was more musical ideas were being developed, and I don't know if what you call perhaps a more symphonic way, perhaps. But the best thing to do is just listen to these things. That's why I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to describe it, because how do you describe music? In this case, you can look at the famous 4 albums that were recorded in 2 days, because Miles wanted to get rid of his recording contract. He wanted to fulfill it because he wanted to move on and, of course, do different things. So he did Cooking, Relaxing, Steaming, and Working with Miles. These are 4 different albums recorded very quickly in a couple of days. And they're pretty extraordinary. And if you, again, listen to some of the late 40s, early 50s bebop albums, and then listen to what, this is called, sort of hard bop, you can definitely hear a distinction. And any of the Cookin', Relaxin', Steamin' albums will do, just to get a sense of this. And you go, and you can hear it quite distinctly. The easier than it is to describe it. And again, listen to so John Coltrane, he kind of went on to have a career. Cannonball Adderley, Red Garland, Sonny Rollins, right? These are all significant figures that Miles brings together, works on the sound, and then they go on and develop the sound in each of them. And if you could follow each of these guys' great career and hear this seed being cultivated and grown out as they worked away from this. But of course, at the same time that he's doing this, and again, once again, his record company would have preferred him to stop and just keep releasing these albums. He had a great band. I mean, look at this lineup, phenomenal lineup, doing well with their public concerts or live concerts. Recordings were doing well, but Miles wanted to move on. He wanted to do something different. And so now we're getting into the mid to late 50s, and what Miles wanted to do was get back with Gil Evans and do these arrangements. And so some of the seminal albums here are like Miles Ahead, which is 57, Porgy and Bess, which is 58, and Sketches of Spain, which is 1960. Now, this is sometimes called third stream jazz, which I just think is people didn't know what to call it when Miles and Gil got together and started doing these bigger arrangements with bigger sonic landscapes and very different palettes. Ravel-esque palettes at times is what I hear in there, but you can listen for yourself. I mean, Porgy and Bess and Sketches of Spain, both, famous and super influential in themselves. And so they released these 3 albums, and again, the record companies really wanted Miles to stop and just keep doing this, because I think he had just switched to CBS at this point. Porgy and Bess and Sketches of Spain, of course, one of the very, very famous, very successful. And you could go, oh, here's an opportunity to exploit these, to explore this territory, to keep doing these large orchestrations, to use sort of exotic sounds from around the world. And in fact, they pressed them to do a kind of bossa nova album, which is not good and didn't sort of alienated everybody involved in the process. But that was the idea. But if you listen to Sketches of Spain, say, which was 1960, and something like Working with Miles Davis, which was just a few years earlier, 2 or 3 years earlier, it's just, these are just different human beings, you would think. How is this possible that this is the same musician, this is the same musical mind that is developing these territories? But it turns out that it is. This is just Miles Davis again, opening up this sort of orchestral jazz capacity that just is phenomenal. Again, the Porgy and Bess arrangements are famous for a reason. And they're just within this almost the same time period with many of the same musicians that he was doing the hard bop with. So instead of continuing to just develop this and work with big orchestration and large orchestras for CBS who wanted him to do this, and I think it's worth stopping there and pondering on the ego issue, because here's CBS, one of the largest recording companies, gives you a juicy contract and wants to put you in a studio with an orchestras and with big productions and do all this studio work. I mean, in theory, this is the dream, right? If you want to be taken seriously as a musician, here is a company that's willing to give you just virtually unlimited resources to explore large orchestral ideas. But Miles is, on one hand, he loved the fame, he wanted to make money, he wanted to be recognized and paid for his work, but he just wanted to do what Miles wanted to do. And so while he's working on these, because Porgy and Bess is like 58, Sketches of Spain is 1960, he also works on the modal jazz, which is, again, not big, elaborate, large production, huge studio albums. They're tiny, small, focused ones. And you can think of two albums, Milestones in 58 and Kind of Blue in 59. And wow, right? Kind of Blue, of course. You may have heard of this jazz album, incredibly famous. So it's using modal composition, which is just a different kind of way of thinking about scales, a way of thinking about the organization of harmonics in the development of a song. And it wouldn't be that big of a deal, but it really, compared to hard bop or bebop, it's just is very different. This is just like a different universe of how to approach the conceptualization and development of musical themes over time. And so Kind of Blue comes out, blows everybody's mind. But that was 1 year after Porgy and Bess. So large orchestrations of an existing musical work, very expressive, very complex, huge, to very stripped down, very spare, modal, beautiful, small studio work. Hugely successful. Obviously, probably the most successful best-selling jazz album of all time. And so you go, right. So in 5 years, Miles Davis has gone from hard bop, cookin', steamin', relaxin', with what's called the first great quartet, because of that lineup with Sonny Rollins, Red Garland, John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Philly Joe Jones, these guys, to Sketches of Spain, Porgy and Bess, miles ahead, with big orchestration, working arrangements with Gil Evans, phenomenal studio work, big production, and Kind of Blue, stripped down modal, Bill Evans now working on the keyboard, working piano, hugely influential, by the way, in Kind of Blue, and sort of helping create the sound and writing some of the songs. Let's think about this. And again, once you release Kind of Blue, the studio wants you to keep releasing Kind of Blue, right? The studio's like, this was a great album. It sold a lot. Let's make more like this. So, of course, what Miles does is decides to, let's form some fusion jazz bands. Let's do electric jazz. And so if you've heard Kind of Blue, which I imagine most people have, very acoustic. It's a piano. It's an upright bass. It's Miles on horn, a saxophone, right? It's a very acoustic, and the recording itself emphasizes the sort of live acoustic ambience of that environment. And so then Miles says, hey, you know what we should do? We should get together a jazz fusion band and just do something entirely crazy again. And so, having been wildly successful doing 3 different things in a short period of time, he decides to do a 4th. And this is he forms this second great quartet with Herbie Hancock, Ron Carty, Wayne Shorter. Again, another ridiculous lineup of people. And this was a short-lived quartet, but it was very influential, particularly because the players themselves, once again, became so influential. And their live performances were particularly famous. But you can look at an album like, say, ESP from 1965. And again, if you listen to Kind of Blue in 1959 and ESP or Sorcerer, again, you're in different sonic landscapes. These are different sonic worlds, even though they're only, 4 or 5 years apart. And so the whole jazz fusion, Electric Miles kicks off. And then he goes even further along this road. Even though the fusion stuff is working, people are liking it, the performances are getting interest, other musicians are tuning in. And he produces, Bitches Brew, which in 1970. So if you listen to the Sketches of Spain in 1960 or Kind of Blue, which is 1959, A decade later, he produces Bitches Brew, which is the 2 album. I mean, who knows what that is? Is it still jazz? It's not clear. It's certainly this amazing exploration of sonic potential with jazz elements. And, he has a whole, John McLaughlin is on there, Chick Corea is on there, all these other players are now circling around Miles, and he launches this phenomenal movement of electric jazz and fusion that basically takes over the planet in, the 1970s and moving into the 1980s. And if you look at the musicians that are playing on these albums, like Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul go on to found Weather Report. John McLaughlin and Coben go on to found Mahavishnu Orchestra. Herbie Hancock, of course, goes on to the Headhunters, Herbie Hancock and the Headhunters. Chick Corea returned to Forever. So you have just this extraordinary collection of musicians who Miles gathers around him, works with, and then they go on to found, incredibly influential band and incredibly influential musical movement after band. At this point in Miles's career, his health begins to fail because of drug addiction and other problems, and so he slows down a bit, but he's still experimenting. He starts putting out other albums like On the Corner, which is very funk influence. It's a great album to listen to, a very fun album, I think, but again, to think of it as someone who had done Birth of the Cool, and then you listen to On the Corner, you're like, wow, this is, again, very different universe. And he does a lot more electronic experiments. He does all kinds of other work. And people continue to listen to him and take him seriously, in part because of all the musicians that he influenced keep bringing him up. So if you read about Miles Davis or you read about other jazz musicians that he influenced, they all, to a person, point to him and say, I was working, I was successful, I was doing whatever, and then I worked with Miles, and I was like, wow, opened my mind. Herbie Hancock talks about how Miles Davis really helped him develop, help him think differently about the notes he was playing and why he was playing those notes. Another player said that Miles Davis yelled at him because he wasn't experimenting enough on stage. And he said, look, I'm paying you to go up on stage and practice. I want you to be out there taking risks. And they said that the magic of playing with Miles is even if you made a horrible mistake, even if you did something that was way wrong, Miles would immediately jump in and play something that made whatever you had done that was wrong sound right. That he could just bridge these crazy musical gaps and just make you sound like, oh, you didn't just mess up completely, that you had in fact, actually done something that was all right. And they said over and over again that he would save you because he really did want you out there experimenting. He wanted you to be trying and to be pushing the limits, because then that would push him to have to create new and to make new all the time. And so I think one of the great moments for understanding Miles Davis is he was going to play at a concert, and I believe this was on the West Coast for one of the jazz festivals, and somebody said, hey, Miles, why don't you play, some of your hits? Why don't you play the stuff that the people who are out there would really be happy to hear you play? Like, they'd be super excited if you played something from, Kind of Blue or one of your other more famous compositions. And he turned to him and said, I ain't no fucking museum. And I think this captures his sensibility. He never wanted to stop and just start playing jazz history, even if it was his own history, right? He never wanted to be retrospective. He always wanted to be looking forward, experimenting, challenging himself, creating new, making new, and surrounding himself with musicians that would force him to do that. And that's an incredibly difficult and rare place to be. And so if we just stop for a moment and review, over these 35 years, which is kind of amazing, Miles Davis was right there in the birth of bebop. He could have stayed there, cultivated that territory, and he would have been an important figure in jazz history. He does the birth of the cool recordings, right? This is right around the 50s. So, the cool movement, the West Coast sound. he could have stopped there. He could have just developed that. He could have stuck with that kind of environment and gone the direction of John Lewis, like a modern jazz quartet, or he could have gone like the cool sound, like a Chet Baker kind of sound. But no, he's not going to do that. He has his first great quartet, the hard bop movement. I mean, Cannonball Adderley, John Coltrane, Red Garland. These are important figures who had this sort of consistent sound, although John Coltrane, of course, famously moves off later, makes one change, makes one leap. That made John Coltrane super famous, right? That one leap. But Miles Davis moves on from there. And then in the later period, late 50s, early 60s, the work again with Gil Evans, who famously said that they said, what were you doing in those years when Miles Davis, from Birth of the Cool to when you started working with Miles again? And he said, I was just waiting for Miles to come back, right? He said, I knew we were going to get back together and do something great. And I was just waiting for that. I mean, he did some things, but he said mostly he was just waiting for Miles. And then Miles came back. And so he did these, again, Miles Ahead, Peggy, and Porgy and Bess, Sketches of Spain. A very different environment that influenced a lot of orchestral arrangements for film, particularly at the time, but also the notion of like you had the early Duke Ellington sound, which that was what jazz orchestration was considered to be. When you listen to Porgy and Bess or Sketches of Spain, this is a very different way of thinking about and conceptualizing the use of those kinds of soundscapes. Then, of course, he moves on to the modal composition, which is a whole style that lots of musicians embrace today. And probably a lot of them, one might even say most of them, but certainly many of them were introduced to that because of Kind of Blue. You hear that sound, you hear that different sort of approach to music, and you think, wow, I want to do something like that, right? I want to make music that has that sort of resonance, those overtones. And then, of course, the whole fusion and electric movement that goes all the way from something like, ESP or In a Silent Way to Bitches Brew, which is really out there, towards, if you want to hear something just crazy and out there, Live Evil is pretty. Dark Magus is another one. Dark Magus is, I think it's a 2-album set, live, free jazz. Like, wow. One suspects there was a fair amount of drugs involved in this production, but at times it just sounds like noise, and then at times it sounds like, wow, they're really onto something. But Dark Magus, check that one out. I think it's worth a listen occasionally. You might like it. You'll probably hate it. But again, Miles Davis was out there experimenting all the time and for decades. And so in music history, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination, I'm just a fan. I'm not an expert in music history. But when I think about the development of famous musical artists, particularly in classical music, I mean, the number of musicians or bands that you can put your finger on that cover this kind of ground, it's just, I can't think of one. I mean, this is extraordinarily deep intellectual development and endless pressing of musical possibilities. Every day he wants to get up and perform something new and perform something different and make something that's from his mind, some experience, something he's heard that he wants to elaborate and develop. And he doesn't want to be held back, and he wants to surround himself with people who are going to help him achieve that. And so he always wanted to strive to be surrounded by the best upcoming players who could challenge him and help him reach new levels and develop new territory. But then he wanted to keep moving. Most people want to stop, and which is not wrong, by the way. It's like, I've developed, I can paint with watercolor, so I'm going to do a bunch of watercolor paintings. That actually makes sense. Miles Davis apparently never wanted to do that. He's like, oh, look, watercolor paint's great. I want to do oil paint. Now I want to do gouache, and I want to, right? He just wanted to keep trying new things and develop new images and new possibilities. And at every moment, you can see these seminal recordings and go, wow. I mean, they were popular. They were influential to other musicians who then picked up these concepts and ran with them in 5, 6, 7 different sort of almost entire genres of jazz, until you had something like Bitches Brew, was like, I don't even know where we are anymore, or even Porgy and Bess and Sketches of Spain. I mean, is this still jazz? What do we mean by jazz? Seems jazzy. And so that kind of just intellectual capacity and unbelievable drive and self-discipline to continually just break your patterns. I mean, break himself. I mean, clearly he paid a price for this personally, psychologically, to continually forcing himself to experiment, to push his limits, to do things he suspected that people might not like, to go up on stage to be able to go up on stage. Maybe this is one way to think about this. If you can go up on stage in front of 5, 10, 20,000 people and play what you know they're going to want to hear and be happy, that's great. But Miles Davis would go up on stage in front of these people, and he knew he could play what would make them happy, and instead he played the ideas that he wanted to explore now to try and force them to come along with him. He wanted the audience to be forced to come along with his development and his music and his ideas. And as much as he wanted to be loved, as much as he wanted to sell albums, as much as he loved the recording contracts and wanted big audiences, he couldn't bring himself to just be a fucking museum, even though all the impulse should have been there for him to do that, and certainly was there for him to do that. And so I think at the end of this arc, he sold millions of albums, influenced dozens of players who themselves have sold millions of albums, opened up whole genres of musical and sonic possibilities that other people have explored for years or decades at this point. And he was one person. He was one man with a horn who just kept pushing and prodding and promoting and trying and breaking himself and breaking his habits and exploring new potentials and new possibilities. And I think even if we move beyond the world of music, it's hard to even think of painters or artists who have pressed this much, or writers who have so significantly moved from genre to genre or form to form to just experiment and develop and explore. And so I think one reason it's hard to appreciate Miles Davis is because he's so rare. He's such a unique figure in musical history because we want someone that we can comprehend, that we can listen to their 10 great albums and go, I know who this person is. I know how their mind works. I know what they were doing. His output was so voluminous, but even if you just pick, the significant albums from each of these periods, you get this just massive diversity. And I think his musical capacities, insights, and power was so great that it's hard for any normal individual to understand it. You can take a part that you love and develop that and love that, but to get some sense of the whole, I think he was just too great. I think his mind was just too large. His intellect and his musical insight and drive was so great that he just sort of leaves, I think, us mere mortals in the dust, or at least perhaps maybe other people who have a much greater musical capacity than I do can sort of get their minds around the whole oeuvre, but I certainly can't. And it's at times frustrating. And so because we can't get a full picture of him, I think we go, we can't, then he's not that big, right? It's odd. He's so large that we can't get all of him, and so it makes him seem smaller, perhaps, something like that. I would say that I think there's also an element of sort of racism is probably part of it, but just also the notion that jazz musicians they aren't often considered real composers or real creators, which is just, of course, nonsense. But there is that sort of tendency to not think of them as having the sort of intellectual drive and capacity that a Beethoven or a Bach has. And of course, almost no one, like a handful of people in history, have had that kind of musical intellect, regardless of genre. But I think Miles Davis might be someone who we should think about in those terms of this creator who just continually developed all of these worlds of sonic possibilities and musical experiences that not just for himself, but he seeded the world with players who then carried the legacy on of those areas, of those developments. And that is extraordinarily rare. And one potentially absurd example to kind of leave people with, that I was kind of pondering this at length, obviously, and I thought of this was like Tolkien, J.R. Tolkien said he wanted to write a book that would encourage other people to create new worlds that were sort of in this world, right? Sort of the nature of the world that he had created. And it's like, oh my gosh, did he succeed, right? When you think of the thousands, if not millions of books that were launched by the incredible achievement of Tolkien, it's like whole genres have been launched from that, like this unbelievably powerful influence. And I think that's part of Miles's greatness. It's not what he did for himself, but what he did for other people to encourage them to launch their own worlds within the kinds of territories that he had pointed to or that they had discovered together, and to give them the encouragement and the inspiration and the opportunity they needed to just go, to make it happen, to make it real. And so, Miles Davis, hard to get grips to the guy because he's so phenomenal and so great. So I would encourage any of you, all of you, if you love music, particularly if you love jazz, I'm sure you've already heard of Miles Davis, but to try just a quick sample tour through Miles Davis's history. It'll blow your mind if you do this. I've done this, of course. Listen to one early, from the 40s, late 40s, Bebop album where he's on an album with, Charlie Parker. Just one song. And then listen to a song from Birth of the Cool. And then listen to a song from Cookin, Relaxin' or Steamin', and then listen to a song from Porgy and Bess or Sketches of Spain, and then listen to a song from Kind of Blue, which of course you've probably listened to before, and listen to a song from ESP, and then listen to a song from Bitches Brew, and then ask yourself, how is this possible? Where does this come from? How is one person able to seed the world with so much great musical possibility and experimentation in such a way that so many people loved it at every turn? But Miles Davis was able to do that. And so I do think this is his greatness, his intellectual capacity, his drive, and his fervent wish to get other people to be their best selves, so they could express their ideas. And again, what a rare combination. Beethoven inspired a lot of people, didn't have a lot of students. Bach had a lot of students, inspired a lot of people, didn't have the kind of musical exploration that we see in Miles Davis. And so when you compare him, he's just very unique, very powerful, and I think one of the underappreciated figures in American cultural history. So Miles Davis, that's what I think his greatness is composed of. Thank you very much.